Hello, welcome to HIST 141, my spring course, U.S. history since 1877. And this lecture is on national politics from the end of Reconstruction basically up to World War I, populists and progressives, two major movements in between end of Reconstruction and World War I. And so we're going to talk about this, put this in perspective of the larger narrative we've been talking about, coming out of Reconstruction, putting the country back together, expanding the country in terms of Western settlement, and then the growth of the country as a great power, economically speaking, and then to a modern urbanized nation. We kind of got through that last week. All that has an impact on national politics. And I come to this last, partly because your textbook does it, partly because I wanted to see, reason why we go through that the first few weeks, to see all the stuff that affects what people are doing. So hopefully one of the things we'll talk about in discussion is how all those other developments which take time and are not necessarily events play into things like elections and political movements, which are easier for us, I think, to understand. So let's get into this and talk about these movements. And first of all, you did have in terms of not just presidential politics, should be national politics, but electoral politics after Reconstruction. You had interest in politics because you did have, we mentioned this in previous lectures, there was a lot of corruption during, for example, the presidency of Ulysses Grant, and later on, there was a lot of it. People knew that. They knew big business had too much influence over government. And so people were actually interested in this. And in fact, you're going to have people demanding change. We've kind of mentioned this already, both to the industrial order, and as well, you're going to have groups outside the elite push for political change. And we'll get to those in a moment. But the electoral politics after, between this period, 1876 and 1892 or 3, is very contested. There were 5 presidents from 1877 to 1893. Most of them Republicans, except for Grover Cleveland, but they were very close elections, which indicate a lot of interest in voting. You had between 1876 and 92 the highest voter turnout in history recorded for presidential elections. The Senate had changed hands 3 times in that period, the House 5 times. And so there were people taking electoral politics seriously. However, by the time you get to, excuse me, the end of the 1880s, people are beginning to tire of the 2 parties. In fact, the Republicans had enacted, some reforms. They were the party of emancipation, after all, but they eventually began to line up behind big business, which they've been more or less ever since until today, basically, in the last few years. And so in that period, you're going to have people disillusioned with the 2 parties begin to, probably the only promising, I guess, possibility for a third party, the People's Party, appear in the 1890s. So we'll get to that in a second. But you also have initiatives at a federal level in the 1880s and 90s, not all of which are successful, that lay the foundations for later reform. One of the things, by the way, that spurs this is the assassination of James Garfield in 1881 by a deranged office seeker, who, if you don't know this story, it's an interesting one. There's actually a local historian. She writes books, best-selling type books, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head. Oh God, this is terrible. She lives in Kansas City. The book is called Destiny of the Republic. It talks about this assassination and how it fuels reform, because Garfield had been elected as that, and his murder sort of spurred this, because his successor, Chester A. Arthur, and Chester Arthur was an interesting guy in his own right. Garfield's from Ohio, but Arthur was one of these New York politicians, sort of a Tammany Hall special. He specializes in corruption. After Garfield's assassination, he had a change of heart and became a reformer, and helped try to reform what's called the spoil system. If you know what the spoil system was, this goes back to Andrew Jackson, but this is the technique, or the act of, whenever a president is new president elected, he'd basically fire all the people who worked in the permanent agencies of government and bring in his own people. To the victor goes the spoils, was what Jackson is supposed to have said. And so what happened is this became basically a way to dole out patronage to your supporters. often, as you can imagine, not because of their ability, but because, oh, they paid you bribes and stuff like this. So in order to try to curb this, civil service reform comes onto the scene. Arthur's the one who signs into law the Pendleton Act in 1883, which created a list of jobs to be filled out on the basis of examinations by a civil service commission, even though for the time being, patrons still accounted for a lot of the jobs in government. It's still a step in that direction. A lot of the leaders of this were influenced by classical liberalism. And again, part of this was an idea, not just idea of one unlimited government. They want more honest government. And so they want more limited, they want more professionalized government. It's one of the reasons they don't trust politicians with this. That's part of this. You also have some efforts to try to deal with the influence of corporations. In 1890, they began, not with workers in general, but 1890, Congress extended pensions to all Union veterans, whether or not they were disabled or not, to protect them from poverty. They also began to try to regulate big corporations. It was soon weakened by the Supreme Court and hard to enforce, but the Sherman Antitrust Act was the first federal attempt to forbid, quote, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy and restraining trade, unquote, to try to rein in the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and their big companies from dominating all the markets. Finally, one way these governments failed, and particularly the Republican Party failed, was they failed in their attempts to protect blacks in the South. Again, they were actually pulled out pull the army out of the South after Reconstruction. African Americans were increasingly less vulnerable to discriminatory laws, but also increasingly physical violence. So in 1890, the Republicans in Congress drafted a bill to create a bipartisan federal elections board. Basically allow people to complain about possible voting irregularities, which there definitely were in the South. So the Democrats nationally screamed and yelled about this. But the reason why it failed was not the South. It met resistance in the North, both from Northern liberals, classical liberals, who wanted the best men, quote unquote, to rule through expertise. Best men meant educated white people, basically. As you'll see in a moment, we'll talk about in a moment, there's a lot of skepticism about democracy among a lot of people in the middle classes. But also from Republicans in the West. With the entry of states after the 1860s, you have a bunch of new senators, and Westerners were really skeptical of all this. And so the bill was defeated and effectively ended any sort of hope for protecting the voting rights of African Americans after that until the 1960s. And part of the reason why this happens, why these protections don't protect as much as they should, is because the courts and the Supreme Court, state courts as well, they will you'll have federal parties, major political parties restricting suffrage at the federal level. Federal courts will invalidate many of the state laws passed to protect workers. Court case called In Re Jacobs, the New York State Supreme Court of Appeals struck down a public health law, so arguing that it exceeded the state's police powers. More famously, in Plessy versus Ferguson, you have the striking down, basically striking down the rejection of challenges to racial discriminatory laws, to Jim Crow laws in the South, which enshrine the ideal of separate but equal into law. And then in Lochner versus New York, that's another workers' rights case. Again, basically striking down laws meant to sort of protect workers from excessive working hours and things like this, that it extended the state's competency. So the courts are very conservative in that regard. They usually are, or they were until the 60s. That'll change in the 60s, but they wanted to restrain governments from doing things, and that's why they did this, at least in their legal thinking anyway. So because of all this, you begin to have the emergence of radicalism, and this is a term, Middle American radicalism, using, I can't remember the gentleman's name, was a scholar in the 1870s who coined this phrase, Middle American radicals. Again, you don't think of Middle Americans as being radical, that's the point of the phrase, but it's where you're going to have people in the middle of the country inject themselves into the international politics and propose radical solutions to what they see as problems. And for the Americans who lived through the 1870s, the 1890s is a sort of back to the future moment, because in the 1870s you had a bad depression. In the 1890s you're going to have a bad depression, and that should be 1892 for the Homestead strike. But you're going to have all of these things, you know, all this labor strife. You're going to have the strike in the Pullman Railroad cars in the 1890s, clashes between, you know, the National Guard and strikers are the biggest expression of this discontent is the so-called Coxey's Army in 1894, which was a protest by a reformer from Ohio who gathered a bunch of Civil War veterans to march to Washington, D.C. I don't know how many there were. Jobless men, I should mention, not veterans, excuse me. He was a veteran of the Civil War, to carry out a peaceful march to Washington, D.C. to appeal for his program, which his idea was to have the U.S. government hire the unemployed to fix the nation's road, to construct a national road system and give them jobs. This is something, by the way, that's going to happen under FDR and the New Deal. And he called his march the Army of the Commonweal of Christ, which should give you an idea where these reform ideas are coming from. It came to be called Coxey's Army, and eventually made it to D.C., got up to the steps of the Capitol building and everything. He was arrested. They were arrested, several of them, for trespassing, and it was dispersed and came to nothing, but it did sort of get people's attention. I've also mentioned the Pullman strike in 1884 as well. So you have labor strife in Brazil, almost all this. You also have one other thing I want to mention about this is that you're going to have in 1894 an issue over money. It's not on the slide, but I want to mention this anyway. Grover Cleveland's the Democratic president at the moment, and he was out of step with his party on a big issue, which is that of coinage. Advocates of free silver, this will be people like, we'll get to the Populist Party in a second, people like them, who they want to expand the U.S. money supply, encourage borrowing, stimulate industry for small businesses and farmers. But Cleveland was an advocate of the gold standard, and he kept it tied to the nation's reserve of gold, the monetary standard. And this will be a big divide. We'll get to this in a moment over this. And in fact, what's going to happen in 1894 is the Democrats are going to get wiped out in the midterm elections. Republicans will sweep the country, except in the South, where it's the only seats where they basically gain strength. Of course, they gained strength for obvious reasons, or for some other reasons. They basically suppressed the Black vote. They had, in some areas, Black Americans had continued to vote in fairly large numbers, but as Democrats began to take hold, they began to appeal especially to racial resentments. And I mention this because you're going to have this, for a brief period, the Populists are going to have a national coalition, which includes people in the South. There's going to be some cooperation between African Americans and white farmers in the South, and this is one of the things that they'll seek. They absolutely hate, and they'll sort of seek to clamp down on, and they'll play the race card to sort of get them to ignore class interests this way. And of course, they will use legal means to undermine the vote of African Americans. Things like literacy tests. Literacy test is, things like understanding clauses. That is the idea that voters would be required to interpret a clause in the state constitution, with local officials, always Democrats, deciding who met the standard for understanding it. And we're not talking, by the way, about a few quotations. We're talking about like several pages long excerpts that were difficult for anybody to read. I doubt the people administering this could have actually read them very well. So again, it was clearly meant to suppress the vote. Other measures like the grandfather clause, where it denied the vote to any man whose grandfather had been unable to vote in the days of slavery. It was struck down by the Supreme Court, but other measures besides this, poll taxes were taken to suppress the vote, which worked. Most of in the South, voter turnout as a whole plummeted from 70% to 34% by 1908. Along with this, of course, you also have the proliferation of segregation laws, a whole host of segregated everything, basically public accommodations, parks, hotels, drinking fountains. And increasingly, this is the heyday of lynching in the South. sometimes happening in broad daylight. So it's a brutal time for African Americans, and the federal government really doesn't do anything to protect them. The first major challenge to all this comes out of Kansas. It comes from Kansas. Kansas, a state full of former Union soldiers, railroad types. Republicans dominate the state, and they despise the Kansas Farmers Alliance, which again is small farmers trying to sort of, again, break through their demands. What happens is in 1890, a bunch of Farmers Alliance ally with the Knights of Labor, the state Knights of Labor in Kansas, and create a People's Party. And that year they stun everybody basically by capturing the lower house of the Kansas legislature and most of the state's congressional seats to Congress. So you have all of a sudden national ambitions of these people. In December of that year, the Southern Farmers Alliance, which is part of this sort of not a political group, but a cooperative group, well, turns toward politics and issues a group of demands in Florida, of all places. I used to live there, so I'm part of my mentioning this, but a list of demands for the federal government to do things. We'll get to these in a second because they get adopted by the National Party, the Populist Party. But the Southern Alliance, I should mention one thing quickly about it. It did have various groups that made up its own cooperative, its own entity. One of those was the Colored Farmers Alliance. There was, again, as I mentioned before, some crossover with African Americans. Not a whole lot, but it had some potential to do that. Didn't do it, but it's one of the things that, again, not for the last time, politicians in the South played up race concerns in order to sort of bury class concerns. In any case, these are adopted as the party platform, the Omaha platform, which I'll get to in a second. In Nebraska in 1892, when the National Party is founded, and they nominate a former Union general named James B. Weaver for president. And in November, I believe this is the best showing for a third party candidate until Ross Perot. We don't know who he is. We'll get to him later on. Wins 9% of the vote, does Weaver, captures over 1 million votes, carries 4 Western states as well as part of 2 others in the Electoral College. Excuse me, 9% of the Electoral College, or not 9% of the total, 9% of the total of the popular vote, 22% of the, we'll get into this, I will show you this in a second, but still, it seems like for a moment you have a real challenge to both of these parties. I'm gonna go over the Omaha platform for a second for reasons that become apparent. On the left-hand side here, you have to have the things they actually demand in the platform. You can go find this on the internet really easy for yourself. They demand an income tax. There is no income tax in the United States in the 19th century. There are other types of taxes. Nobody taxes your income. They demand government ownership of utilities. I don't know if they meant national or state, but they were demanding it. Unlimited coinage of silver and gold. Again, there's the silver issue coming back. And again, remember, this has to do with the gold thing, has to do with the international monetary standards, which back then are tied to gold reserves, which are better for the country, in some ways, but not necessarily great in terms of for some people on the domestic front, economically speaking. And then finally, the end of alien ownership and monopolies, alien ownership of corporations. They're thinking about foreign companies investing in the United States. And of course, monopolies like, Standard Oil, stuff like this. On the right-hand side, you have additional resolutions. They want to restrict immigration. So that's a party that's been a party of any sort of labor platform until the 1960s. They demand presidential term limits. They demand the direct election of senators. If you don't know, prior to, we'll get to this because this is when it changes, but up until the early 20th century, senators were elected by state legislators, not by the peoples of the states themselves. That's in the original Constitution. It's changed in this period under pressure for reform. Referendum and ballot initiatives. And then finally, the end of federal subsidies to private entities. Again, they're thinking of like the railroad companies and big corporations. So it's a radical in some ways. It's not socialist, but it's pretty radical in many ways. Some of the demands they're making. Here's just a little ticket to the National People's Party Convention, Omaha, Nebraska, July 2nd, 1892. Admit one. Kind of see again you have this people power movement here in the Midwest. And there's the election map I was talking about. You have, and you see how this breaks down. Republicans, their bases in the North and the Midwest, and the far West, because you have all these new states, the Dakotas and everything. But the Populists win 4 Western states: Colorado, Kansas, Nevada, and Idaho. They get parts of, electorally speaking, North Dakota and Oregon. So 22 electoral votes, 5% of the electoral vote, excuse me, but 9% of the popular vote. And you can see how this map looks. Notice how much of the electoral power of the Democrats is in the South. A lot of it. And some in the North as well, Midwest. So interesting maps there. And yet, things will change after 1894 and 1896. In the midterm election of 1894, the Democrats were crushed. And so in response to this in 1896, they basically tried to co-opt a lot of the agrarian labor program of the Populists in 1896. And they nominated a young William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, who was a defender of farmers, as well as a huge opponent of the gold standard, and so understood their concerns. And in the 1894 elections, the Populists suffered a lot of defeats, and so they wound up throwing their instead of running their own candidate in 1896, they backed Bryan for president. But their power was always already on wane. Bryan ignored them. He ran as a straight Democrat without ever acknowledging being nominated. He was nominated officially by the Populist Party. Even despite all this, the Populists reached their high water mark in 1896. They won 22 seats in the House and got 5 senators elected, but they never really recovered from these defeats because the Republicans basically managed to brand populism as anarchy. They embraced immigration. That's definitely a new one for the Republicans. They abandoned their support of temperance, the temperance movement, which we'll get to in a second. And the Republicans went all in with corporate-backed donors, and they denounced Bryan as a crazy person. And McKinley won handily in the electoral vote in 1896. And so there's a major realignment going on with this. Yeah, I had to mention this at this period. I should be on the slide, but something to keep in mind. There's a wave of reforms being enacted after this, but there are reforms that basically exclude voters because majority party leaders wanted to shut out future threats from new movements like the Populists. As in the South, a lot of northern states imposed literacy tests and restrictions on voting by new immigrants. Keep out that influence. And in the wake of those types of laws, voter turnout declined there too, just like in the South. And in fact, basically everywhere, the electorate became more narrowly based, more native born, wealthier. And the reason why was middle-class leaders didn't trust the people. They worried about the effects of too much democracy. They wanted fewer voters. This is why once they restricted the voting pool, that you start to get major parties increasingly turning to direct primaries, asking voters to elect them. Once they get the people don't like not voting, they're okay with them voting for them. And you'll see this. This is what you get in 1913, the 17th Amendment of the Constitution being passed, which required that U.S. senators would be chosen by popular vote. It's the consequence of these very undemocratic laws being passed to restrict the electorate. Again, by many reformers, not the populists, mind you, but other reformers. What other reformers? Funny you should ask. We'll get to that in a second. Here you have a cartoon mocking William Jennings Bryan and his speech, which was his speech at the Democratic Party National Convention accepting nomination in 1896, this famous Cross of Gold speech, where he was talking about you're going to crucify mankind on a cross of gold. meaning you're putting the concerns of the rich ahead of those of the poor or the working man. And he's satirized here as being someone who's bringing religion into politics, which is pretty rich. But this is what that's the thing at the bottom, the sacrilegious candidate. So he's a wild man, an anarchist, revolutionary, et cetera, et cetera. Here you see, this is pretty good actually. Crown of Thorns used by Brian, um, used in Brian's Chicago speech, Cross of Gold, again, mocking his religiosity. Interesting turn. And again, not religiosity, but saying it's blasphemous. And generally, this is effective when they cocoon him that way as a radical. You have an image of a new type of reformer, the progressive governor and then senator from Wisconsin, Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette is someone I'll get to in a moment who conducts comes up with some new ideas in his state, and which will eventually be brought to the national level later on. But you kind of see him addressing the people there, progressive reformers. The progressives are a lot different than the populists in some regard. They both see themselves as doing things for the people, and you see him here surrounded by voters talking to them. And that's that's in some ways characteristic of progressive and populist politicians. But it's a major change, especially at the national level. And here you have one of the progressive standard bearers of the era, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, giving a whistle-stop tour and a speech to people. This was a new thing. Before the influence of the progressives and the populists, presidential candidates didn't campaign in person. Why? Because they thought it was beneath the dignity of the office. Well, people become disillusioned about the office. I need to, convince voters to vote for you. Well, you go to them. That's when this starts, basically, under Teddy Roosevelt. At least he's one of the first people to do this, I think. But it's a huge change in politics, indicative of where the country is going. Which brings us to the height of the progressive era. You can probably extend that back to the 1890s, but I'm going to say because of him. 1901 to 1917. You have in 1900, William McKinley getting elected again very easily, beating Bryan again. But something happened in his second term. 6 months into his term, he was shot as he attended a fair in Buffalo, New York. Died eight days later. And thus, Theodore Roosevelt became president. We need to talk about Roosevelt here because he's kind of this wasn't planned at all. Let's put it this way. Roosevelt was born to a prominent Dutch family. Dutch, founded New York. So it's old family, prominent family. Sickly child who made himself through exercise into a more manly man, became a cattle rancher, later on New York City Police Commissioner, and gained a name for himself as a progressive, a reformer in the Republican Party in New York, an opponent of Tammany Hall style politics and corruption, railed against corporations and all that stuff. Also a bright guy. He actually wanted to be a professional historian at one point, but left to go off and become a cattle rancher instead. But he, and someone, by the way, who had you can actually hear his voice, the recordings of it. Looks, build himself as a manly man, has this high squeaky voice that sounds like this. It's really like weird, but he's a patrician type. But he's a patrician type who appeals to the people. And it's very peculiar. He has a sensibility for the people, but he's also very much a paternalist. He thinks he knows best what the people need, and is not too thrilled about actual things like populists. Let's put it that way. A paternalist populist is probably what I would use to describe him. Anyway, he was chosen by Republican leaders to be vice president as McKinley, so they could get rid of him. They didn't want him to be involved in politics. They were against reform, so it was kind of alarming to them when he got into the presidential office. However, he was not quite as radical as his critics feared. He was still a Republican who had denounced the populists. And he was still more friendly to big business than a real radical would have been. He won fame, for example, as an environmentalist, but a lot of his conservation policies had a strong pro-business bent. He increased the amount of land held by the federal government for forest reserves, and turned turn their management over to a new Forest Service, but he insisted on fire suppression to maximize logging potential. It was about national resources to him. He also lent his support to the Newlands Reclamation Act, et cetera, all this other stuff. Again, the idea of, using the federal government for this stuff for the national good, and rather than necessarily environmentalism per se. And nonetheless, the fact he had some generally supportive attitudes toward business, he did try to curb them in a little bit. During a strike in 1902, a coal strike, he threatened to nationalize the coal companies if their owners refused to negotiate with the unions, which they promptly did. He also sought better enforcement of the Interstate Commerce and Sherman Antitrust Acts. In 1903, he pushed through the Elkins Act, which prohibited discriminatory railway rates that favored powerful customers. Remember, that was one of the big complaints of populists. And so he did do some things, but he very much believed in a strong national government of the quote unquote best men. And this normally meant what he meant by Anglo-Saxon superiority. He meant white men, basically European men. Despite this, he invited Booker T. Washington, the African-American educator, to the White House to dine with him, which earned him condemnation for people who were racists. He advocated for elite rule, but also defended the dignity of laborers. Later on in his public career, he'll read and recommend works by socialists from Europe. So it's a very much a pattern of, on the one hand, condescension, but also sort of middle class, upper class activism, which is going to characterize a lot of people on the progressive side. They're very activist. They do want to do good things for people. They also really think they know better than the people themselves what they need. At the same time, you have progressive experiments going on across the country from the 1870s onward, trying to push government in directions, make it work for people in better ways. One of these, the most successful of these, will be the temperance movement, and which is driven by women. A lot of women, middle-class women, get into progressive reform movements. I'm not even mentioning, it's not on there for some reason, but the suffrage movement goes back before that period. That's why. But women are a main cog in the temperance movement. Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded in 1873. And by the way, if you're wondering why women in particular were involved in the temperance movement, they believed that spousal abuse was connected to alcoholism, was one of their main motivations. It's also, by the way, as the name indicates, a lot of this comes out of the Christian churches, Protestant churches. And you have them, but you also have, after that, a wave of progressive social activists who are partly inspired by the emerging fields of sociology and social science. Social scientists focused on the urban poor, and they were arguing that there were social circumstances that made the poor the way they were. It wasn't merely a matter of individual laziness and ignorance. And they placed a lot of emphasis on social research and social scientific, quote unquote, solutions to social problems. And out of this, you get things like the National Consumers League in 1899 forming, which again is basically designed to get the government to give oversight to standards for consumers. It becomes an advocate for protective legislation. It will be one of the driving forces behind the Supreme Court decision in 1908, Muller versus Oregon, which upheld an Oregon law limiting women's workday to 10 hours. So you're going to have this on that side. You're also going to have a powerful movement I mentioned coming out of the Christian churches, one that's mostly made up of, and I'm going to use this term lightly, but the only way I can put it is, I'll say progressives, one way to put it. Liberal Protestantism is the other word for this. There's a movement of both pastors, but also theologians who turn into activists, who were going to advocate for what they call the social gospel. This gets coined in the early part of the 20th century. What this refers to is a bunch of ministers and theologians who they think basically the Christian message requires people to deal with social problems. That because, again, going back to this modern idea, and this is, by the way, most of the theologians associated with this are self-consciously modern. They embrace modern social science. A lot of them will embrace things like evolutionary theory, biologically speaking. They want to make Christianity relevant to the modern world, and they think the Christian gospel requires you doing things about the social conditions that make for poverty and stuff like this. And so you're going to have theologians. The most famous of these is Walter Rauschenbach, Baptist minister, Hell's Kitchen, New York. And he began advocating social justice type stuff. In 1907, he published a book called Christianity in the Social Crisis, which he railed against the selfishness of capitalism and promoted what was essentially a form of Christian socialism that supported the creation of labor unions, cooperative economics, all this other stuff. Advocated, again, a whole host of things. Alleviation of Sunday working hours, elimination of child labor, creation of insurance for workers in factories. And this is I'll get to this a little later in a couple of weeks, talk about cultural concerns, but this is definitely part of a split within the Protestant Christian world. It's mostly a Protestant thing, where you have this emphasis on social gospel, the idea that, again, not personal holiness, not growth in, personal virtue or whatever, but social justice, social activism is the way to live out the gospels. It has a big impact. I say this because a lot of these people in these progressive movements that we see as secular and kind of they either started out or remain part of some of these Christian churches. And theologians like Rauschenbach put this in, world historical terms, that, this was a new moment in human history and a new moment of, the awakening of man's consciousness, the awareness of the poverty of the people and all this stuff. It did have, however, the social gospel movement, which put a lot of emphasis on education and reform, had kind of a dark side, as did the progressive movement as a whole. That's why I'm mentioning them together so much. A lot of the reforms they initiated, along with the other urban reformers, were often resented by the working classes as unwelcomed forms of social discipline. Just think, by the way, of Josiah Strong. I mentioned him last time. Those are the type of people who are progressives, who have very dim views about immigrants, who have dim views about, Catholics and Jews and stuff like this. And in fact, a lot of the reforms the progressives put in place are going to have a darker side to them. Again, I'm not trying to it's not all black and white. There's a dark side of this, put it that way. And in fact, eventually the social gospel will basically become secularized in a lot of ways, although it still retains to this day the connection. If you don't know, what's her name? Oh my goodness, Hillary Clinton came out of a Methodist background, which was influenced by this idea. So this connection is still there dimly anyway, but it's part of this progressive movement throughout the country. A lot of churches adopt this stuff, these ideas. And then finally, one of the major progressive movements that emerges later in this period is the Black movement for civil rights. In the wake of the Plessy decision and other, lynchings going on in the South, a bunch of African American leaders begin to emerge. People like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida Wells Barnett, a journalist who undertook a crusade against lynching. And in 1905, Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, who was a prominent Philadelphia newspaper editor, called for a meeting at Niagara Falls, on the Canadian side, by the way, because the U.S. side would not admit blacks in their hotels. And they issued a manifesto arguing for full voting rights, end of segregation, equal treatment in justice system, education, jobs, et cetera. Not long after this, a bloody race riot broke out in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, just the home of Abraham Lincoln. And appalled by this, a New York settlement worker named Mary White Ovington called together a group of sympathetic progressives. This led into their meeting in 1909 to create the National Association of Advance for Colored People, NAACP. Most of the leaders of the Niagara movement joined this, and W.E.B. Du Bois became the first editor of its journal, The Crisis. And they will begin, along with other allies in the Black churches. It'll cooperate with the National Urban League in 1911. And they will do a lot of the hard legwork for the next several decades that will set up these very, NCAA is a major one, but other groups, both in terms of, legally speaking, challenging laws, educating people and stuff like this. So it also begins in this era, probably the most successful of the progressive movements, to say the least. There are also other experiments in the states. I mentioned these already. Specifically about La Follette and his so-called Wisconsin idea. And the Wisconsin idea basically just means more government regulation of the economy. And one of the things, again, about progressives, they tended to rely heavily on experts. La Follette relied on experts from the University of Wisconsin for economic recommendations. And yet, again, he did this with an eye for improving people's lives. He won battles to restrict lobbying and give citizens the right of recall, the ability to vote to remove unpopular politicians from office. This is how we got Arnold Schwarzenegger as the governor of California. And referendum. This is the other thing. Referendum is one of the things advocated by populists, voting directly on proposed policy measures. He would go on to have a long career in the Senate as well. You also have labor experiments, particularly with more radical forms of association. Labor reforms advanced to the states mostly, things like workman's comp laws and stuff like this. And so you'll have stuff emerging from the cities. However, you also have creation of a couple of parties. First, there's the Socialist Party of America, founded by, among others, Eugene Debs, who will run for president 4 times in 1904, 8, 12, and in 1920 from prison. That's right, he ran for president from prison, which is kind of great. And so you have some pressure there. In fact, between 1910 and 1917, you're going to have several states enact insurance laws covering on-the-job accidents. You're going to have mostly coming from the states, partly because the federal system hampered national initiatives, and so the states were the best bet to get laws passed. That, and also because, again, remember the strategy favored by the biggest union in the country, the American Federation of Labor, was not politics, but improve wages and working conditions through self-help and negotiation with companies themselves. They called voluntarism. And so you have a reluctance to engage in politics. This begins to change, though, by the early 1910s. You're going to have more radical groups emerging. In 1905, the Western Federation of Miners joins other radicals to create a new movement, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWWs, soon be called the Wobblies. And they will be basically, this is the first true Marxist party that we have in the United States. They believed in resisting the workplace and ultimately launching a general strikes to overthrow capitalism. They do involve themselves in some violence. They were involved in the riots out in Colorado in 1914 there. So you have radicalization there as well. And then finally, one thing under the label of experiments. For the most part, progressive experiments were about practical things. They only really produced one original thinker that I'm aware of amongst most of these people in terms of government, or at least I think the most original and most important. Doesn't get enough credit, I don't think. It's a guy named Herbert Croly, who was a Jewish intellectual and author from New York City, was the editor of the New Republic magazine, which is still in existence. And he published a book in 1909 called The Promise of American Life. And he's very important for a lot of reasons. And what he argued was that only a concentration of political power, state power at the federal level, executive level, could guarantee social justice for everybody. This could only be achieved by state power, which then redistributed wealth so as to make possible equal opportunities for everyone. And he had this idea that, I'll give you some quotations in a minute, that human nature was perfectible, that it wasn't, it wasn't static, it didn't have limits ultimately. And his ideas gave progressivism a much more clear idea of what they wanted, what progress should mean. The goal meant a society in which the state would seek to remedy social ills and render society more and more perfect and more equal. That is to say, to use the government to make the country more democratic by making opportunities more equal for everybody, guaranteed by a strong national state. And the thing that's unique about this is that it's not really the way he frames this is that he basically frames this in very American terms. What the title of the book, Promise of American Life. He yokes together concerns about democracy They went back to Thomas Jefferson with Hamiltonian concerns about nationalism. In other words, he's not doing this as an internationalist. He's not doing this out of admiration for European ideas or socialism or Marx. This is a peculiarly American, almost patriotic thing for him. And it's very kind of unique. And he will have a lot of influence, even in his lifetime, although he didn't really know this. His book was not really widely read. Only 7,500 copies were sold in his lifetime. But it was read by, among other people, Theodore Roosevelt, who gave a speech in 1910 in, of all places, Osawatomie, Kansas, on what he called the new nationalism. The new nationalism, but basically was nationalism with a strong state, which he stole the phrase from Herbert Croly's book. And again, what they're opposing here, by the way, the state is they're opposing the individualism of American life, because individualism, too much freedom, has caused inequality, the suppression of rights, and so hence the need for a large national state to make the country more equal, more one entity, if you like. And so his appeal is that he embraced ideas of nationalism, national greatness, while yoking it to a more democratic ideal, socially democratic ideal. So the state, science, social control are a big part of progressivism. And by the way, the poor man died in 1930. And if you don't know, we'll get to this next few weeks. The Republicans dominated the 1920s, and all his ideas were basically, had no influence. He died thinking he was a failure. His ideas will be taken up in the 1930s, or at least the general tenor of them, by FDR. So he's crucially important for the future of progressivism, which, if you haven't mentioned it already, by the way, progressivism today, we think of Democratic Party as associated with progressivism. It is a bipartisan thing. There are progressives in both parties in the early 20th century. So it has a foothold in both parties, as we're going to see here in a second. And there's just a picture of Herbert Croly from 1925. Again, very bookish guy. Again, an interesting figure. Doesn't get enough play. I don't think I mentioned him partly because of that, because I think it does encapsulate a lot of what the progressives were thinking. And finally, of course, we come to the era after Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt declines to run in 1908, steps down, and lets his Vice President Taft succeed him. He defeats William Jennings Bryan. And in the wake of the victory, though, problems began to open up. Why? Because there was a split between between conservatives in the Republican Party and insurgents. And by insurgents, I mean progressives. Conservatives were like, at this point, we've had enough reform. We're done with it. The insurgents, very militant progressive types, thought that Roosevelt hadn't gone far enough. And so Taft was simply unable to reconcile these differences. And he found himself increasingly on the opposite side of progressive Republicans. And they began to plot their own path. And in fact, after he had left the White House, Roosevelt had gone on a year-long safari in Africa. When he got back, he began to sense an opportunity. And so the Taft's dispute with progressives needed him because he gave his famous speech in 1910 in Osawatomie, making the case for his new nationalism. And in early 1912, he announced himself as a candidate for the Republican nomination. And he swept through the state that held primary elections. Again, it had beginning to have prominent primaries by then. However, other places, Taft controlled the party caucuses. And so, dominated by those caucuses, the Republican National Convention chose Taft. Roosevelt and his followers walked out, and they formed the Progressive Party, offering his new nationalism directly to voters. It got called the Bull Moose Party because of him and whatever. And he wasn't the only one. In 1912, you also had Eugene Debs, again, making an appearance on the ballot. And again, advocating for socialism, emphasizing democratic process as a means to defeat capitalism. And he had a fairly minor role in the election. Among the new generation of leaders, the Democrats selected Woodrow Wilson, was a Virginia-born historian and political thinker who had been president of Princeton University for a while. And as governor of New Jersey, he compiled a record as a progressive, as a reformer, including the passage of workers' compensation, utility regulation. And so they put him on the ticket to capture the sort of reform movement this way. And what happened was pretty predictable. There were 4 candidates on the ballot, lots of excitement, but the division between the Republicans, Taft and Roosevelt, made it inevitable that Wilson would win. He wins with only 42% of the vote. Roosevelt got 27, Taft 23, Debs 6%. Wilson would have lost, and Roosevelt would have won if he'd been nominated by the Republicans. And so you have Wilson being elected, who's kind of a weird guy. We'll get to this. We'll get to this actually about Woodrow Wilson, 1912, who he is. Need to stop and make this a little longer than I wanted to, but need to talk about Woodrow Wilson. That's a picture of him from 1870s, 1880s when he was a younger man. You'll see pictures of him later. He's got spectacles on. I want to give you the younger picture because Wilson was a weird guy, sort of old-fashioned, but he was a reformer. That's why he got elected. From the South, born in Virginia, grew up in South Carolina and Georgia. Went to law school in Virginia and briefly practiced law in Atlanta in the 1880s before going to graduate school at Johns Hopkins University in the 1880s, writing his dissertation there. And he'll become an active historian. He writes about an essay about cabinet government, and he's interested in those sorts of things, making government work better. And also wrote a multi-volume history of the United States as well. And in fact, he has the distinction of being the only United States president to this date who actually attained a doctorate of any kind, PhD. Later on, he went, because he also got his degree, also attended Princeton when he was younger as well, went back to become president of Princeton University, and he made his name as a reformer there as well by trying to abolish private clubs to discourage privilege among the students. This was deeply resented, but it gained him the admiration of reformers. He was also a thoroughgoing racist. I have to say this right now. Again, a lot of people were, definitely most people were by our standards, but even by the standards of the time, he was a racist. As president of Princeton, he discouraged blacks from applying. And while he was president, he basically allowed his subordinates to segregate federal agencies, which they had not been since Reconstruction. The film Birth of a Nation by W.D. Griffith, which was a film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan, was actually screened for him at the White House in 1915, even though he never made any public statement on it. And when a delegation of Black Americans protested his discriminatory actions, Wilson told them, as the direct quote, "If the colored people make a mistake in voting for me, they ought to correct it," unquote. So you have a very old-fashioned sort of guy on the one hand, but also a progressive. He believes in government as a science. He believes he'll become to be very idealistic too. He's mostly known for his his foreign policy. We'll get to that next time. But I'm not a big Woodrow Wilson fan, if you can tell. So, but he has this odd sort of backwardness, and yet he will prove to be more radical as a reformer than was Theodore Roosevelt. Despite all this, during his presidency, he passes between 1913 and 1916 a series of laws designed to benefit workers. He convenes a commission on industrial relations, originally appointed by Taft, which called for laws to protect workers' rights. And so he takes up the mantle that basically happened with William Jennings Bryan of protecting laborers, protecting farm laborers as well. He did, by the way, as for reasons that are obvious, absolutely nothing to help African Americans in the South. Of course, he had company in that Republican Party. It's the big race is one of the big black marks against progressivism in this period. There are others, but that's one of the big ones. They did very little to help them in political terms. But he did do things like get the 16th Amendment passed, which creates the income tax. He also passes a Federal Reserve Act in 1913, creating a series of banks to give a nation a banking system more resistant to financial panic, to help out, again, business people, small businesses, farmers. He eventually went after the trusts. His lawyer, Louise Brandeis, Attorney General, I guess I should say, um, believed in free market competition. And so they passed the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914, which amended the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, closed some of the loopholes in it. A new Federal Trade Commission was created with more broad powers to decide what was fair, to investigate companies and issue cease and desist orders against anti-competitive practices. He also did several other things in terms of creating compensation for workers. And in other words, in fact, Wilson, old-fashioned guy that he was, oversaw the greatest expansion of federal power, at least in domestic terms, since Reconstruction. And he did so really on the basis of an idea we'll come back to, which is progressivism's idea that the modern world is so different. You have to take up radical solutions, or different solutions, in order to solve the social problems. In other words, the social crisis caused by industrialization is so big, only state power can do anything about it. Walter Lippmann, who was a progressive journalist and also a philosopher, writer for the New Republic, and sort of flagship magazine of these progressives, summed up the progressive mindset in 1914 this way: Americans had, quote, no precedents to guide us, no wisdom that wasn't made for a simpler age, unquote. And so progressives thought they had to find new solutions for everything. And this is where a lot of their radicalism comes from. As we'll see in a few weeks, not all of them necessarily are good. And last thing, just to show you one last chart, give you an idea. These are the amendments to the Constitution that are passed in the progressive era. And if you notice these three, if you go back and look at the chart I gave you on the Populist Party platform, notice how many of these you basically have two of these that come directly from the populists: income tax, direct election of senators. Again, those are things the populists were advocating. These last two, the 18th and 19th Amendment. 18th Amendment, of course, is the amendment for prohibition. That was definitely not, prohibitionists didn't have any, temperance movement had no influence on the populists. The 19th Amendment, of course, which comes about only during World War I, is women's suffrage, which is definitely a progressive movement, and definitely on that different part of the scale. So lots of legacies from these two movements. Still with us, obviously, in very different guises, but populism, people against elites, against experts, then a progressivism, which is for expertise and more wants to sort of give the people what they think they need, are the two great movements, which again, you can kind of see in this course how this is 150 years ago when this starts, and yet it's still relevant to us today. It still helps define us. So that is it. That is all for this lecture. See you guys next time. We'll talk about foreign policy in the next lecture. Thank you guys, and take care.